A millionaire grandmother was indifferent to her son and grandson because she thought they were insignificant people. Until one day, while she was watching TV, she was stunned when she saw something, so much so that the next day her law team was urgently summoned. The early morning air was crisp, the kind that made coffee steam dance in the cold. A bakery down the street released the scent of fresh bagels, and distant car horns mixed with the rhythmic sound of Frank's coffee stirring. Kevin sat at the kitchen counter, poking at his breakfast with the kind of exaggerated lethargy only a 6-year-old could master. "I've been thinking," Kevin said, dragging out the last word. "That's never good," Frank muttered, taking a sip of coffee. Kevin ignored him. "School is a flawed system. 6 hours of confinement, questionable lunch policies, forced interaction with strangers. I don't think it's for me." Frank exhaled slowly, setting his mug down. "Kid, we've been through this. First grade is non-negotiable. You're not a 40-year-old retiree, no matter how much you talk like one." Kevin sighed dramatically. "I could be homeschooled." Frank raised a brow. "By who?" "Me. Unless your curriculum involves changing car oil and eating cereal for dinner, I don't think that's a good idea." Kevin narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying my education isn't a priority?" "I'm saying," Frank grabbed his jacket, tossing Kevin's tiny backpack to him, "that we're leaving in exactly 1 minute, with or without you dressed." Kevin groaned, but slid off the stool, muttering under his breath about educational rights. By the time they reached the truck, Kevin had transitioned into silent protest, arms crossed, mouth in a firm line. Frank glanced at him as he pulled onto the road. "You know, Kev, a lot of kids would be excited for their first day of school. A lot of kids also believe in Santa Claus. Intelligence isn't a numbers game." Frank shook his head, smirking. "I don't know where you get this stuff." "The internet. Figures." As they approached the school, Frank purposefully slowed the truck and pulled into the closest lane to the entrance. Kevin straightened, eyeing the large school doors warily. "This is the best parking job of your life," Kevin noted. "I hope you understand the historical significance." Frank rolled his eyes. Yeah, out you go, VIP." Kevin hesitated. For the first time that morning, his usual confidence wavered. His fingers tightened around his backpack straps. Frank softened. "Look, bud, it's just school. You're going to do great. And if it helps, just imagine everyone's terrible at math. That should make you feel better." Kevin exhaled, steeling himself. "I'll allow this logic." "Generous of you." Kevin climbed out, but lingered by the door. That's when Frank spotted a young woman standing near the entrance, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the arriving students like she was cataloging them. She had that polished but practical look, smart blazer, casual flats, no-nonsense posture. Kevin followed his gaze. "That's my teacher," he said, less than thrilled. "You haven't even met her." "I don't trust people who smile this early in the morning." Frank chuckled. "All right, let's go say hi." Kevin groaned but walked beside him, though Frank could feel him dragging his feet. As they approached, the woman noticed them and smiled warmly. "Good morning. You must be Kevin." Kevin stared at her, assessing. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "I see my reputation precedes me." Frank snorted. The woman's smile widened. "I'm Miss Diana. I'll be your teacher this year." She turned to Frank. "And you must be the unpaid chauffeur, mechanic, and full-time therapist." Frank extended a hand. "Frank." Diana shook it, amused. "Nice to meet you, Frank." "Likewise, and just so we're clear, if this one causes any structural damage to the school, I was never here." Diana laughed. "Noted. But I have a feeling Kevin will do just fine." Frank smirked. "Yeah, that's what they always say in the beginning." Kevin sighed. "This has been fun, but let's cut to the chase. Where do I sit, and how much math are we doing today?" Diana raised a brow. "Impatient to get started, Kevin shrugged. Just making sure I'm intellectually stimulated. Frank clapped a hand on his shoulder. And on that note, I'm going to leave before he starts a debate about standardized testing. Diana chuckled. Don't worry, Kevin. I think you'll find plenty to keep you busy. Kevin looked skeptical, but followed her inside. Meanwhile, outside, Frank lingered in his truck longer than he intended, sipping his coffee as he watched parents scatter. He knew Kevin would be fine, more than fine. But that nagging feeling settled deep in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when he first noticed how quickly Kevin picked up new things, how effortlessly he memorized information, how much he resembled Sandra in ways that went beyond appearance. Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair before finally pulling away from the curb. The day had begun, but something told him this was only the beginning of something bigger. The sharp scent of motor oil clung to the air, blending with the faint aroma of burnt coffee from the corner of the garage. Frank leaned against the workbench, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. His crew was scattered, one guy under a lifted sedan, another arguing with a customer about why duct tape wasn't a valid car repair solution. You know, Frank, Marty, his oldest mechanic, leaned against the toolbox, chewing a toothpick. I've been thinking. Frank sighed. That's never good. Marty ignored him. A guy like you, mid-30s, decent face, owns his own business. Why aren't you married yet? First of all, Frank gestured vaguely, I'm insulted you had to specify decent face. Second, if I had time to date, I wouldn't be standing here debating my love life with a guy who thinks beer is a food group. Marty grinned. You keep dodging the question. Kevin isn't getting any younger, you know. Kid needs a maternal figure. Frank rubbed his temple. He's 6, not an orphan in a Dickens novel. Still, Marty shrugged. Ain't healthy for a kid to grow up with just a grumpy grease monkey for guidance. Frank let the comment slide. The truth was, he'd thought about it, more than he cared to admit. But life wasn't a Hallmark movie where mechanics found love at PTA meetings. His priority was making sure Kevin had everything he needed, and right now, that was stability. His phone buzzed. The screen flashed. School pickup. All right, idiots, Frank called out, tossing his work gloves aside. Try not to set anything on fire while I'm gone. Marty smirked. No promises. The day passed as usual. Oil changes, brake repairs, a particularly stubborn transmission that had him cursing under his breath. He liked the work. It was honest and straightforward, unlike everything else in his life. By the time he picked Kevin up from school, the kid was already full of stories. They did a spelling test today, Kevin announced, climbing into the truck. I finished before everyone else. Frank chuckled. That doesn't surprise me. I also may have corrected the teacher's example on the board, but in my defense, necessary is a tricky word for a lot of people. Frank groaned. Kid, we've talked about this. Kevin shrugged. What was I supposed to do? Let 20 other students learn the wrong spelling? That's educational negligence. Frank shook his head, suppressing a grin. At this rate, you're going to be running that school in a month. Kevin smirked. At least that way I could control the lunch menu. That night, while Kevin read at the kitchen table, Frank stared at the stack of mail he'd been avoiding. Bills, paperwork, a lingering letter from the school about Kevin's advanced progress. He ran a hand over his face. He knew what was coming. Meetings, tests. People were telling him what Kevin needed, just like before. He wanted Kevin to be happy, but happy didn't always mean gifted programs and accelerated learning. It didn't mean pressure and expectations. He just wanted Kevin to be a kid. The next morning, Frank was back at school, leaning against his truck while Kevin adjusted his backpack straps. All right, don't embarrass yourself today. Kevin raised an eyebrow. I think you mean, don't embarrass you. Frank pointed at him. Exactly. Before Kevin could fire back, a familiar voice cut in. Frank. He turned to see Diana approaching, coffee in hand. She had that effortlessly put-together look, sharp, but not stiff, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Miss Diana," Frank greeted, matching her nod. Kevin grinned between them, looking back and forth. "Well, well, well. Looks like I might be getting a step-aunt sooner than expected." Frank nearly choked. "Kid, go to class." Kevin smirked, but obeyed, waving dramatically as he disappeared inside. Diana chuckled, shaking her head. "He's got a sharp wit." Frank sighed. "Too sharp." Diana took a sip of her coffee, eyes studying him with quiet curiosity. "So, is intelligence a family thing?" Kevin's way ahead of his peers. Frank exhaled slowly. "Kevin takes after my sister. Sandra was like that too. Brilliant, quick, always a step ahead." "Me?" He shrugged. "I'm just the guy who fixes cars." Diana frowned. "I don't buy that." Frank tilted his head. "Oh yeah?" She smiled. "Kevin's confidence, his humor, his ability to adapt, those things don't come from genetics alone. They come from the person raising him." Frank was caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. He wasn't used to being praised for anything outside of fixing a transmission. Diana checked the time. "I should head in. Just wanted to say, you're doing a good job." Frank watched as she walked back toward the school. Kevin was at the window, watching with a mischievous grin. Frank sighed, shaking his head. "This kid's never going to let me live this down." But for the first time in a while, he didn't mind. The late evening air in Boston had a sharpness to it, the kind that made city lights shimmer just a little brighter against the darkened sky. A light drizzle had dampened the sidewalks, leaving reflections of neon signs rippling in the puddles. Inside a small, tucked-away cafe on the corner of Maple Street, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the quiet hum of conversation. Diana sat at her usual table near the window, papers spread out before her, red pen tapping absently against her chin. She liked working here, low light, quiet atmosphere, the occasional whir of the espresso machine breaking the silence. It was a nice escape from the rigidity of the school setting, a place where she could think. She was midway through grading an essay when the bell above the door chimed. She barely glanced up, until she heard a familiar voice ordering at the counter. "Black coffee, and, hold on, let me check. Yeah, one of those muffins, but, less fancy." Diana smirked. "Frank." She watched as he stuffed his change into his pocket, waiting for his order. He looked tired, his jacket damp from the misty rain outside, but he still had that same easy posture, like he wasn't in a rush for anything, even if the world was moving fast around him. "Didn't expect to see you here," she called out. Frank turned, mildly surprised before his expression shifted into something wry. "Didn't expect to be here." He glanced at her papers. "You grading or plotting world domination?" She chuckled. "Bit of both." Frank grabbed his coffee and wandered over. "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the chair across from her. "By all means. What brings you to my quiet little hideout?" Frank leaned back in his seat, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "One of my guys is pulling a late shift at the garage. Figured I'd grab him something before heading back." Diana nodded, setting her pen down. "How's Kevin?" Frank huffed a quiet laugh. "The same. Too smart for his own good. He's got half the teachers talking about his potential." He rubbed his temple. "I try not to make a thing out of it, but it's getting harder to ignore." Diana folded her arms, studying him. "He really is exceptional, Frank. That's not something you can just brush off." Frank exhaled. "Yeah, I know, but I've seen this before." He swirled his coffee absently. "Sandra, my sister, she was like that. Genius-level smart. Skipped grades, graduated early, became a professor before most people figured out what to do with their lives." Diana leaned forward slightly. "That's impressive." Frank's expression shifted, a flicker of something more complicated in his eyes. "It was, until it wasn't." He hesitated. She died a few years ago. Car accident. Diana's grip tightened around her cup. I'm sorry. Frank nodded, but his gaze was distant. Kevin reminds me of her sometimes. The way he just picks things up like it's nothing. It worries me. Diana frowned. Why? Frank was quiet for a moment. Because being that smart, it's not always a gift. It can be a weight. People expect things, push things. Sandra never got to just be. Diana let that settle. Outside, a car rolled by, its tires hissing against wet pavement. Maybe Kevin's different, she said after a moment. He has you. Frank let out a low chuckle. Lucky him. I'm serious. She met his gaze. You're aware of what went wrong with Sandra. That means you have the chance to do things differently for Kevin. Frank didn't reply right away. He just sat there, coffee cooling between his hands, something unreadable in his expression. Diana shifted gears, sensing the weight in the conversation. Well, for what it's worth, he's making friends. A few of the other kids are starting to notice him. Frank smirked, not sure if that's a good thing or a recipe for disaster. Diana laughed. A little of both. He's got that sharp tongue. Some kids love it, some don't know what to do with it. Frank sighed. Sounds about right. Diana tapped her pen against her papers. And he's stopped mentioning his achievements at home, hasn't he? Frank's jaw tensed slightly. Yeah, how'd you know? She offered a small, knowing smile. Kids sense things. If they feel like something makes the people around them uncomfortable, they adjust. Frank stared into his coffee. He hadn't realized it until now, but it made sense. Kevin wasn't bragging about school anymore. No updates on spelling tests. No enthusiastic retellings of math challenges. He was holding back. Diana's voice was gentle. I know you want to protect him from what happened to Sandra, but maybe protecting him doesn't mean avoiding it altogether. Maybe it means guiding him through it. Frank exhaled slowly, nodding. The cafe's door chimed again as a new customer walked in, breaking the quiet. Frank glanced at the time. I should go. Muffin's getting cold. Diana smirked. Tragic. Frank stood, hesitated for half a second. Thanks. For the talk. She nodded. Any time. As he stepped out into the night, the rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cool. Frank adjusted his jacket, his thoughts lingering on the conversation. Maybe Diana was right. Maybe Kevin didn't need to be sheltered. Maybe he just needed someone to help him navigate it all. The golden glow of the afternoon sun stretched across the playground, catching in the edges of fallen leaves that danced in the breeze. Laughter echoed from different corners of the schoolyard. Kids chasing each other, swinging from jungle gyms, their voices blending into a kind of pleasant chaos. Kevin sat on a bench near the edge of the field, his lunchbox balanced on his lap. Across from him, a boy named Jonah was frowning at a math worksheet, tapping his pencil against the page in frustration. You don't carry the one here, Kevin pointed out, gesturing to the problem Jonah had scribbled over 3 times. That's why your answer keeps coming out wrong. Jonah squinted. That doesn't even make sense. Kevin sighed, flipping the pencil around to erase the mistake himself. Trust me, I wouldn't lie to you about something this serious. From a few feet away, a girl named Lily leaned in. Jonah, just listen to him. Kevin's like a math wizard. Kevin smirked. Math magician, technically. Jonah groaned, but let Kevin adjust his work. Within minutes, the problem was solved, and Jonah looked up, stunned. Huh, that actually worked. Told you, Kevin said, casually biting into his sandwich. Despite being younger than most of his classmates, Kevin had settled into his own niche, helping with homework, cracking jokes, and keeping up just enough to be included in games. But there was always a gap, something just slightly off. He understood things they didn't. He thought differently. That evening, sitting on the couch while Frank absent-mindedly flipped through TV channels, Kevin voiced it out loud. Do you ever feel different from everyone else? Frank turned his head slightly. You mean because I'm a handsome bachelor raising a 6-year-old genius? No, never. Kevin rolled his eyes. I'm serious. Frank sighed and muted the TV. What's going on, kid? Kevin hesitated, then shrugged. I like my friends, I really do. But I don't always feel like I fit in. They get excited about stuff that doesn't really interest me, and when I talk about things I like, they look at me like I'm weird. Frank rubbed his chin, thinking. You know, when I was a kid, I wasn't anything like Sandra. She was the smart one. People noticed her. I was just the regular kid who got by. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But different isn't bad, Kev. It just means you stand out in ways other people don't. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Did Sandra ever feel this way? Frank exhaled slowly. Yeah, bud, I think she did. He reached over and tousled Kevin's hair. But that doesn't mean it has to be hard for you. You've got me, and I'm always going to have your back. Kevin nodded, a small smile creeping onto his face. Even if I accidentally take over the school one day. Frank grinned. Especially then. The conversation stuck with him, even the next morning when he dropped Kevin off at school. As usual, the schoolyard was alive with chatter, parents saying quick goodbyes before hurrying off to their jobs. But today, something was different. There were cameras. A few men in button-up shirts with press badges adjusted their microphones, and a woman in a sleek blazer held a clipboard, discussing angles with a cameraman. The school principal stood nearby, hands clasped in a mix of excitement and nerves. Frank frowned. What's happening? Kevin glanced around and shrugged. I think the news is here. It seems they are trying to promote a model school of the city. Frank's gut twisted. And you're sure you're not the main character? Kevin looked mildly offended. Not everything is about me. Frank squinted at him. Kevin sighed. Fine. There's a small chance I may have been asked to answer some questions. The headmaster said so yesterday. Frank groaned. Kid, too late. Kevin grinned and took off before Frank could protest. Inside, the news team set up in the main hallway, where a backdrop displaying the school's achievements had been arranged. Kevin had been called up by his teacher, and he stood calmly under the lights, while a reporter crouched beside him, microphone in hand. Kevin, the reporter said, smiling warmly, we hear you're quite the bright student. Kevin tilted his head. I mean, I haven't failed anything yet, if that's what you mean. A quiet chuckle spread through the crowd. The reporter's smile widened. Your teachers say you have a remarkable memory and a natural talent for problem solving. What do you think makes learning fun for you? Kevin considered this for a moment. It's fun when you get to figure things out on your own, like a puzzle. But also, I think people should just ask more questions. Sometimes, the best answers come from curiosity. Frank, who had ended up lingering near the back of the crowd, rubbed a hand over his face. He's going to end up running for office, I swear. Diana, standing next to him, smirked. If he does, I hope you're ready for all the campaign interviews. The segment aired later that evening, and across the country, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the New York skyline, Barbara watched it unfold. The boy on the screen, his sharp eyes, his poised answers, his effortless intelligence, was familiar, unmistakably familiar. It was Sandra, not just in looks, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke with certainty, with ease, the way he answered without doubt, without hesitation. A slow, icy realization crept through her. Kevin wasn't just a bright child. He was meant for more. Barbara reached for her phone, her fingers tightening around it. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't something to ignore. She had lost Sandra once. She wouldn't lose Kevin. The hum of the car engine was steady, smooth, almost too quiet for Barbara's liking. She preferred silence when she traveled, but tonight, The quiet stretched too far, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Outside, the city lights of Boston flickered through the tinted windows, but she wasn't paying attention. Her gaze was unfocused, lost somewhere in the past. She could still see Sandra as a child, hunched over her desk, a pencil tapping absently against her lip as she worked through complex equations that most adults would struggle to grasp. The dim glow of the desk lamp illuminated her sharp, focused eyes, the way her brows furrowed in deep concentration. "Frank, stop running in the house. Your sister is studying." Barbara's voice had been firm, unwavering. Frank, sweaty from playing basketball outside, had grumbled but retreated, leaving Sandra undisturbed. Sandra always had a disciplined mind, a brilliant mind, the kind that couldn't afford distractions. Barbara had ensured she had everything: private tutors, elite schools, connections that most people could only dream of. She had molded Sandra into excellence, believing that with enough pressure, brilliance could be sharpened like a blade. And yet, Sandra was gone. Barbara's hands tightened into fists in her lap. The expensive Dior dress was also wrinkled because of that. She had done everything right, gave her daughter every opportunity, guided her toward a life of prestige, intelligence, and purpose. The pride, when a talented female millionaire gives birth to an outstanding daughter. And now, as she watched Kevin on that television screen, it was as if Sandra had come back to life. A second chance. The car slowed, pulling up in front of a modest, worn-down auto garage. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, its letters buzzing faintly in the cold night air. Barbara barely concealed her distaste. This was where Kevin had been living. She stepped out of the car with quiet grace, her coat falling perfectly over her tailored suit. The air smelled of motor oil and metal. Displeasure settled in her chest, but she smoothed it over with composure. She had come to take back what belonged to her. Inside, Frank stood behind the counter, flipping through a stack of invoices. The smell of grease clung to the air, mixed with the faint scent of stale coffee. It was late, and most of the crew had already left for the night. The chime of the door opening barely registered with him, until he looked up, his stomach clenched. Barbara, standing in his garage, looking as out of place as a diamond in a junkyard. His grip on the papers tightened. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. Slowly, he set the invoices down. "Well, look who finally remembered she has a grandson." Barbara's expression didn't shift. Frank. Her voice was cool and calculated, the same voice she had always used when delivering statements rather than conversations. Frank exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face. 2 years, Barbara. 2. And now, out of nowhere, you show up. Let me guess, this sudden urge to see Kevin has nothing to do with the fact that he was just on TV. Barbara didn't deny it. She didn't need to. "I came because Kevin is wasting his potential here," she said smoothly. "He needs a proper education. He needs guidance, structure." Frank let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, that's rich. And what, you're the one to give it to him? Where was all this concern when he was just a regular 6-year-old kid who needed a family?" Barbara's eyes remained unreadable. "Frank, I know you love him, but you're not equipped to raise a child like him. He has Sandra's mind." "Yeah," Frank interrupted, voice sharp. "And I know what happened to Sandra." Barbara's expression flickered for a moment, just a split second of something that might have been guilt or regret. But then, it was gone. "He needs opportunity," she pressed. "With me, he'll have the best education, the best resources. He can be anything he wants." Frank's jaw clenched. "And what if he just wants to be a kid?" Barbara tilted her head slightly. "You think this life is enough for him?" Her gaze swept over the garage, unimpressed. "Fixing cars, scraping by." Frank stepped closer, voice low. "This scraping by life is a hell of a lot better than what you gave Sandra." The silence between them thickened. Barbara inhaled, steadying herself. She had expected resistance. She had expected Frank's stubbornness. But this wasn't about him. It was about Kevin. "If you love him," she said finally, "then you'll want what's best for him." Frank exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Yeah, I do. And that's why I'm not handing him over to you." The front door creaked. Both of them turned. Kevin stood there, backpack slung over one shoulder, blinking at them both. He had just returned from a friend's house. Diana had dropped him off. His gaze flickered between them. Barbara smiled, adjusting her posture. "Hello, Kevin." Kevin frowned slightly, tilting his head. Hi?" Frank immediately moved, standing between them just slightly. Protective, instinctive. "This is your grandmother," Frank said, voice measured. "Barbara." Kevin blinked again. "Oh." Barbara's smile didn't falter. "It's nice to see you." Kevin, however, just nodded awkwardly, adjusting his backpack strap. There was no warmth, no recognition, just vague politeness. Frank almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. Barbara didn't let the awkwardness linger. "Kevin, how would you like to come live with me?" Kevin's eyes widened slightly. What? "With me, you'll have everything," Barbara continued smoothly. "The best schools, the best tutors. You'll never have to worry about anything." Kevin glanced at Frank, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. Frank's hands tightened into fists. Kevin had always been smart, and he was smart enough to know that something wasn't right here. He took a step closer to Frank. Barbara saw it. Frank saw it. And for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her composed features. Kevin may have been Sandra's grandson, but he wasn't Sandra, and he wasn't going to be easily taken. The light in the kitchen was dim, casting long shadows across the counter. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet space as Frank rinsed off the last dish, his mind still circling the conversation from earlier. Kevin sat at the table, legs swinging idly beneath his chair, a serious expression on his face. He'd been quiet since Barbara left, but Frank had known it was only a matter of time before the questions came. And sure enough, they did. "Frank." Kevin's voice was softer than usual, hesitant. Frank dried his hands and leaned against the counter. "Yeah, kid." Kevin traced the rim of his juice glass with his finger. "Why is Grandma here now? She never came before. Did she not like me?" Frank exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew Kevin wasn't asking out of spite or anger. It was pure, childlike curiosity. "She..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's not that she doesn't like you, Kev. It's just... she has her own way of thinking about things. And for a long time, she didn't think she needed to be part of your life." Kevin frowned. "But now she does?" Frank nodded. "Now she does." Kevin took a thoughtful sip of his juice. "Because of the TV thing?" Frank sighed. "Yeah, probably." Kevin tilted his head. "That's kind of weird." Frank smirked. "You're not wrong." Kevin thought for a long moment before finally looking up, eyes steady. "I don't want to live with her." Frank's chest tightened. "You don't have to," he assured him. "I won't let that happen." Kevin seemed reassured by that, nodding once before hopping off the chair. "Okay." He hesitated at the doorway before glancing back. "You're sure?" Frank forced a confident smile. 100%. But as soon as Kevin disappeared down the hall, that certainty cracked. Because he knew Barbara, and Barbara never gave up. What was the weather like where you were when you heard this story? Leave a comment below. The sharp click of Barbara's heels echoed across the marble floor of her penthouse. The room was vast, modern, the kind of space designed to impress rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, the twinkling lights of New York casting their reflection across sleek furniture and carefully curated art pieces. Her lawyer, Richard Hayes, sat across from her, briefcase open, a thin stack of documents neatly arranged in front of him. He was a man who never asked why, only how much. And right now, his client was an exceptionally wealthy woman with a singular goal. "I want custody of Kevin," Barbara said, her voice even, unwavering. Hayes adjusted his glasses, flipping through his notes. "On what grounds?" Barbara barely hesitated. "Neglect, lack of educational opportunity, an unsuitable living environment." Hayes exhaled slowly, steepling his fingers. "Frank has legal guardianship, no criminal record, a stable business. That's going to be an uphill battle." Barbara's gaze sharpened. "Then I expect you to make the climb." Hayes nodded, already scribbling down potential strategies. Frank didn't have to wait long for the next move. 2 days later, a letter arrived, a legal notice. Barbara was filing for custody. The words on the paper were cold, clinical, challenging the competency of the current guardian, questioning financial stability, living conditions, and the ability to provide for Kevin's future. Frank stared at the document, pulse thrumming in his ears. She was really doing this. That night, Frank found himself at Diana's doorstep. She answered in sweatpants and a loose sweater, blinking in surprise when she saw him standing there. "Frank?" He held up the paper. "Barbara's taking me to court." Diana's eyes widened as she stepped aside. "Come in." Frank walked in, rubbing a hand down his face. The stress was starting to settle into his bones. He hadn't even figured out how to tell Kevin yet. Diana took the paper from him, reading it carefully. The way her jaw tightened told him everything he needed to know. "She's really going through with it," she muttered. Frank let out a dry laugh. "You sound almost as shocked as I am." Diana set the paper down. "You need a lawyer. I need a miracle." She gave him a pointed look. "Frank," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, I know. I'll find one." Diana softened. "You're not doing this alone." Frank met her gaze. "You sure?" "Because I have a feeling this is going to get real ugly." Diana didn't flinch. "Then we fight ugly." And for the first time that day, something in Frank's chest loosened. The news spread fast. Some people, dazzled by Barbara's wealth and reputation, whispered that maybe she was right, that Kevin deserved more, a better future. Others, those who had seen Frank raising Kevin alone for years, knew better. They knew the sacrifices, the late nights, the unwavering love. Lines were drawn, sides were taken. And in the middle of it all was Kevin. He wasn't stupid. He saw the way adults looked at him, how conversations stopped when he entered the room. He overheard fragments of tense discussions, words like custody battle and best interest. And one night, long after Frank thought he was asleep, Kevin sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering for the first time, what if he didn't belong here at all? The cold, polished floors of the courthouse reflected the fluorescent lights above, stretching into long, sterile lines that seemed to hum with the tension in the air. Frank sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped together, jaw clenched. Across from him, Barbara sat poised, elegant and unreadable, her lawyer whispering something into her ear. Kevin sat between them, small in the oversized courtroom chair, swinging his feet slightly as he looked around. He didn't understand all the formalities, but he understood enough. This was about him. The judge, a stern woman with salt and pepper hair, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Let's proceed. Mrs. Whitmore, as the petitioner, you may present your case." Barbara's lawyer, Richard Hayes, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Whitmore, is here today because she believes it is in the best interest of her grandson, Kevin Whitmore, to be placed under her guardianship." Frank barely concealed a scoff. Hayes continued, pacing slightly. "Mr. Callahan, while well-intentioned, does not have the means or the resources to support a child with Kevin's potential. My client can provide Kevin with an elite education, a secure financial future, and a level of care that Mr. Callahan simply cannot match. Frank leaned forward, voice tight. Kevin isn't some investment portfolio. He's a kid. Hayes didn't even blink. A kid who deserves opportunity. The judge turned to Barbara. Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to say anything before we proceed? Barbara stood, smoothing down her designer blazer. Your Honor, I respect the role Frank has played in Kevin's life, but I cannot stand by and watch my grandson waste the gifts he has been given. Intelligence like his should not be squandered in a garage or a public school. He needs structure, guidance. Frank exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. The judge turned to him. Mr. Callahan, do you have a response? Frank stood, running a hand through his hair before speaking. Your Honor, I don't have a fancy speech, but I know Kevin. I know what makes him laugh. I know what kind of cereal he picks when he's had a bad day. I know he pretends he doesn't care about the spelling bee, but he still stays up practicing words just in case. His voice softened slightly. I know him because I raised him, every single day. He turned, looking at Barbara. And where was she? His voice didn't rise, but it carried across the room. Where was she when he lost his mom? Where was she when he had nightmares at 3 a.m, when he needed someone to help him with his first bike? Where was she when he was just a kid? Barbara's lips pressed into a thin line. Frank turned back to the judge. You want to talk about the best future for Kevin? The best future is the one where he knows he's loved, not just managed. The judge studied him for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. She glanced at Kevin. Kevin, would you like to say anything? Frank immediately stiffened. He hadn't wanted Kevin involved more than necessary. But Kevin straightened, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair. Yes, ma'am, he said clearly. The courtroom fell silent. Kevin turned slightly toward Barbara, choosing his words carefully. I know my grandma is smart and rich, and she wants me to be like my mom. Barbara's expression softened ever so slightly. But I don't want to be my mom. I just want to be me. Frank's breath caught. Kevin turned toward the judge, his voice steady but small. Frank takes care of me. He listens to me. He makes me pancakes when I get good grades, and he lets me stay up late on weekends. He doesn't care if I get every answer right. He just cares if I'm happy. He seemed like a father to me, even a mother. The entire room was silent. Kevin swallowed. I love Frank. I want to stay with him. Barbara's face was unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. The judge folded her hands. Thank you, Kevin. That was very brave. She turned back to the attorneys. Due to the complexity of this case, I will not be making an immediate ruling. A child psychologist will evaluate Kevin's well-being and living situation, and we will reconvene after the report is filed. Frank exhaled slowly. He had hoped for an immediate decision, but at least he hadn't lost. The judge gave a final nod. Court adjourned. The gavel hit the wood, and just like that, it was over. For now. Frank barely had time to turn before Kevin launched himself into him, hugging his waist tightly. Frank ruffled his hair, his throat tight. You did good, kid. Barbara watched them, her expression carefully neutral. But as she turned to leave, Frank saw something in her posture. Doubt. And for the first time, he wondered if she had finally realized. She wasn't just fighting for Kevin's future. She was fighting against it. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city and the occasional honk of a passing car. Frank drove in silence, his knuckles tight around the steering wheel. Kevin sat in the passenger seat, his small fingers drumming against his jeans, his mind clearly still tangled in the events of the day. You all right, kid? Frank finally asked, his voice softer than usual. Kevin hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Frank wasn't convinced. He sighed, shifting gears as he turned onto Diana's street. "I need to take care of something," he said, keeping his tone light. "Think you can hang out with Diana for a bit?" Kevin looked over, studying his face. "Is it about Grandma?" Frank hesitated, then gave a half smile. "Yeah, bud, it is." Kevin didn't press further. Instead, he nodded. "Okay." Frank pulled up to Diana's house and walked Kevin to the door. Diana took one look at them, at Frank's tense shoulders, at Kevin's slightly drooped expression, and understood without needing to ask. "Hey, Kev," she said gently. "I just made cookies." Kevin perked up slightly. "Chocolate chip?" Diana smirked. "Obviously." Kevin stepped inside, but before Frank turned to leave, Diana caught his arm. "Frank," she said quietly, "whatever you're about to do, don't lose yourself in it." Frank exhaled, meeting her gaze. "I just need her to hear the truth." Diana searched his face, then nodded. "Be careful." Frank nodded back before turning toward his truck. Barbara's penthouse was as pristine as ever, untouched by the messiness of real life. The soft hum of the city below barely reached inside, muted by thick glass and wealth. She stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her hands clasped together, staring at the lights beyond. But she wasn't seeing them. The words from the courtroom still echoed in her mind. "I don't want to be my mum. I just want to be me." For the first time in years, uncertainty settled deep in her chest. Had she truly failed Sandra? Was she now doing the same to Kevin? Her thoughts were interrupted by the chime of the elevator. A moment later, Frank stepped into the room. He didn't belong here. His presence was too rough, too real against the polished, cold perfection of her world. He carried something under his arm, a small black case. Barbara turned, masking her surprise. "I assume you didn't come to admire the view." Frank exhaled, setting the case down on the sleek glass coffee table. "Number I came to end this." Barbara's gaze flickered to the case. "What is that?" Frank sat down, his movements slow, deliberate. Sandra's voice. Barbara's fingers curled slightly, but she remained composed. "Excuse me." Frank clicked open the case, revealing an old cassette tape and a printed report. Before Sandra died, she recorded something. For me. For Kevin. His voice was quieter now, laced with something unreadable. "And I think it's time you heard it." Barbara's carefully held mask faltered for the first time. Frank pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, Sandra's voice, soft but steady. "Frank, if you're listening to this, it means I didn't get to tell you everything I should have. I'm sorry for that." Barbara's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Mom wanted me to be perfect, and for a long time, I thought that was love. The late-night study sessions, the pressure, the expectations. I told myself it was all for something bigger, that one day I'd feel whole. But I never did. She wanted me to join the project of genetically modifying humans with the scientists in her team to create exceptional people. I couldn't destroy those babies. I couldn't go against nature. I wanted to be more than a project, more than a list of achievements. But every time I tried to breathe, she tightened the leash. Every time I wanted to stop, she pushed harder. And when I said no, when I told her I wouldn't let them experiment on me, she called me ungrateful. A sharp breath. A pause. "Frank, I don't want Kevin to be me. I don't want him to be trapped in the same cycle of always being the best and never being enough. If something happens to me, promise me you won't let Mom turn him into another project. Let him be happy." Barbara's hand trembled slightly, but she tightened her jaw, forcing herself to remain still. The tape crackled. Then, Sandra's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm so tired, Frank." Silence. Then a soft click. The tape ended. Frank leaned back, watching Barbara. She was drowning, And you never saw it. Barbara swallowed, her throat tight. I gave her everything. Frank slid the second document forward. A medical report. And it still wasn't enough. Barbara hesitated before picking it up. As her eyes moved over the words, her breath hitched. Traces of sleeping pills were found in the bloodstream at toxic levels. Impaired motor function, likely cause of vehicular accident. Her grip tightened. No. Frank's voice was flat. She was exhausted. She was on medication because she couldn't sleep, because of you. The weight of it all pressed against her, suffocating. She had spent so long convincing herself Sandra's death had been a tragic accident. But the truth was here, in her hands, in her daughter's voice. And she had no one to blame but herself. For the first time in decades, Barbara Whitmore had nothing to say. Frank grabbed the tape recorder. Kevin's not yours to mold, he never was. Barbara sat motionless, the weight of the truth pressing against her chest like an iron hand. The perfectly arranged world she had built, the one where she had done everything right, where she had crafted excellence from the raw material of her children, was crumbling before her eyes. Sandra's voice still echoed in the room, in her bones. I don't want Kevin to be me. Let him be happy. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, forcing composure. She would not break, not here, not in front of Frank. He was still watching her, waiting, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. Say something. Barbara lifted her chin. What do you expect me to say, Frank? That I'm some kind of monster? Frank let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. I expect you to see it, to see what you did to her, and what you're trying to do to Kevin. Barbara inhaled sharply. I gave her everything. I made sure she had the best education, the best opportunities. Frank slammed his fist against the table, rattling the glass. You broke her, Mum. The sheer force of his voice cut through the room like a blade. Barbara flinched. Frank exhaled, shaking his head. You never let her be a person, just a project. Just proof that your way of raising kids was the right way. He pointed to the tape recorder. And when she tried to escape it, you made her feel like she was failing you. You controlled her so much she couldn't even sleep without something to numb her brain. Barbara's nails dug into her palms. I never meant for her to... But she did, Frank snapped. She's gone, Mom. She's dead. And you still think you're in the right. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Barbara turned to the window, her shoulders taut, staring out at the glittering city skyline. You don't understand, Frank. You never understood. You were always so ordinary. You had the luxury of being mediocre, of playing basketball, of wasting time with friends. Sandra didn't have that. She was extraordinary. She needed to be shaped, refined. Frank's stomach twisted. She was your daughter, not a damn science experiment. Barbara's gaze didn't waver, but something in her hardened expression flickered. Frank's voice lowered, but the anger didn't fade. And now you want to do the same damn thing to Kevin? Barbara turned fully, her eyes sharp. Kevin is different. Frank shook his head. Number. He's 6. He's a kid who likes making dumb jokes and staying up late and eating cereal straight out of the box. And if you take that from him, you'll kill him too. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not the way Sandra... He cut himself off, breathing hard. But piece by piece, until there's nothing left of him but whatever you think he's supposed to be. Barbara's fingers twitched. Frank saw it, the tiny crack in her unshakable resolve. Admit it, he pressed. You don't love Kevin. You love the idea of Kevin. You love what he could be if you raised him. But the real Kevin, the one who makes faces at me when I mess up my coffee order, the one who stayed up late last night trying to learn a magic trick. He shook his head. You don't know that kid. Barbara swallowed. That's not true. Frank scoffed. Really? Then tell me, what's his favorite bedtime story? Barbara blinked. Frank crossed his arms. What does he always ask for at the diner on Saturday mornings? Silence. Frank stepped closer, his voice quieter now. What was the last thing he was scared of? Barbara's lips parted, but no words came. And that was the moment it hit her. She didn't know. She didn't know Kevin. Not really. She had built a future for him, mapped out every step of his life before he had even taken his first. But she had never once stopped to ask who he was now. Frank exhaled, his voice softer. I know you think you're doing this for him, but you're not. You're doing it for you. Barbara's hands clenched at her sides. Her breathing was steady, but inside, her foundation was crumbling. She had spent her whole life believing she knew best, that her way was the only way, that without her, her children would be lost, rudderless. But Sandra had drowned under that weight. And Kevin had chosen Frank, not because he was rich, not because he had connections or opportunity or the perfect plan, but because he loved him. And love wasn't something that could be engineered. Barbara closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, something in her posture had shifted. For the first time in decades, she looked tired. She reached for her purse, pulling out a slim envelope. Without a word, she placed it on the table. Frank frowned. What is that? Barbara's voice was quiet. The legal withdrawal of my custody petition. Frank froze. His heart pounded, but he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't dare believe it, until she lifted her gaze to his. You win, Frank. The words sounded bitter and broken, but they were real. She stepped back, picking up her coat with careful precision. I'll be on the first flight back to New York tomorrow, she said evenly. Frank studied her, searching for some kind of trick, some hidden loophole. But there was none. Just a woman standing in the ruins of a life she had built. Barbara reached for the door, but before she stepped out, she hesitated. Frank, she said, not turning back. Take care of him. Frank's throat tightened, but he nodded. I always do. And then, without another word, Barbara walked out of the apartment, the door clicking shut behind her. Frank let out a slow, shaky breath, running a hand over his face. It was over. Not with a grand battle, not with a dramatic fight, just a quiet surrender. And for the first time in his life, Frank realized Barbara hadn't just lost. She had finally let go. The morning light filtered through the small kitchen window, casting warm golden streaks across the countertop where Kevin sat, swinging his legs as he absent-mindedly poked at his pancakes. The world outside felt different, lighter somehow, as if the tension that had loomed over them for weeks had finally evaporated into the crisp autumn air. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee, watching Kevin over the rim of his mug. You're quiet this morning, he noted. Kevin shrugged. Just thinking. Frank set his coffee down and pulled out the chair across from him. About what? Kevin hesitated for a second, then tilted his head. So, does this mean Grandma's gone for good? Frank let out a slow breath. Yeah, bud. She's gone. Kevin didn't say anything for a moment, just chewed thoughtfully. Then finally, he asked the question Frank had been expecting. Do you think she ever really wanted to know me? Like, actually know me? Frank ran a hand through his hair. He wouldn't lie. Kevin deserved honesty. I think she wanted something from you, Kev, but I don't think she ever really tried to know you. Not the way she should have. Kevin nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer, but needed to hear it out loud. Then he picked up his fork and stabbed a piece of pancake, as if that were the end of that. Okay, he said simply, before stuffing the bite into his mouth. Frank smirked. That's it? Kevin shrugged. Yeah, I figured if she really wanted to be my grandma, she would have tried a little harder. He chewed, then grinned. Besides, you make better pancakes. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Damn right I do. Later that afternoon, Frank leaned against the counter at the garage, flipping through some invoices. But his focus was shot. His mind kept replaying the last few days, the courtroom, Barbara's defeat, the way she had finally walked away. He hadn't expected it to feel so anticlimactic. He thought victory would come with some big moment, some feeling of triumph, but all he felt was tired. The bell over the door jingled, and Diana strolled in, shaking the cold from her coat. Please tell me you finally stocked real coffee in this place, and not just whatever sludge you keep in that machine. Frank snorted. You drink 1 cup of overpriced coffee a day, and suddenly you have standards. Diana smirked. I've always had standards. You're just slow to catch up. Frank rolled his eyes, but there was something in the way she leaned against the counter. Something steady. Something there that made the tension in his chest ease just a little. She studied him. How's Kevin? Good, Frank said, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. Better than me, probably. Diana nodded. You okay? Frank exhaled. I think so. It's been a long road, you know. She gave him a small smile. Yeah. But you did it. You won. Frank let out a quiet chuckle. Doesn't feel like winning. Just feels like surviving. Diana tilted her head. Maybe that's the point. Maybe this wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about making sure Kevin had someone willing to fight for him. Frank met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Diana reached for his coffee mug and took a sip without asking. Still terrible, she said, wrinkling her nose. Frank huffed a laugh. Yeah, Diana grinned, setting the mug down. Come on, let's grab some real coffee, and maybe something for Kevin before he starts another philosophical debate about the ethics of homework. Frank chuckled, grabbing his coat. Deal. That evening, Kevin sat on the floor, surrounded by Legos, constructing something that vaguely resembled a spaceship. Frank sat on the couch, watching as Kevin furrowed his brows in concentration. You gonna tell me what that is? Frank asked, nodding toward the Lego creation. Kevin grinned. It's a spaceship, obviously, but not just any spaceship. It's a custom-built ship, designed for a pilot who doesn't want to follow anyone else's path. Frank arched a brow. Sounds familiar. Kevin smirked but didn't say anything. Instead, he added a tiny Lego figure to the cockpit. Frank watched him for a moment, then leaned back against the couch. You know, Kev, you don't have to be anything other than who you are. Kevin looked up, something unreadable in his young eyes. Frank continued, voice steady. You don't have to be the smartest. You don't have to be like Sandra. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just get to be you. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked down at his spaceship, adjusting one of the wings. That's good, he said casually, because I like being me. Frank swallowed past the lump in his throat. Yeah, kid, I like you being you too. Kevin grinned. Even when I beat you at chess? Frank groaned. I let you win. Kevin snorted. That's a lie. Frank ruffled his hair, grinning as Kevin laughed and tried to dodge him. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension, no looming battle, just the quiet, simple peace of a life they had fought for. And for Frank, that was more than enough. A year had passed. The seasons had come and gone, leaving their mark in the small but steady changes in their lives. Kevin had grown an inch taller, his humor sharper, his questions even more profound. The garage had seen some renovations, new customers rolling in, and a certain schoolteacher had become an unshakable part of their routine. But today wasn't about work, or school, or even the ordinary rhythms they had built together. Today was a wedding. Frank adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time, scowling at his reflection in the mirror. This thing is choking me. Kevin, standing beside him in a tiny suit that made him look both unbearably adorable and far too grown up, smirked. You look like a real businessman now. Maybe you should start fixing cars in a tux." Frank shot him a look. "Yeah, 'cause nothing screams competence like changing oil in a bow tie." Kevin grinned. "Well, you're stuck with it for the day. No grease stains allowed." Frank sighed dramatically. "Remind me why I agreed to this." Kevin tilted his head, as if thinking, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe because you love Diana." Frank rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the smile creeping onto his face. "Maybe." Kevin's smirk softened into something quieter. "I think it's good. You and Diana. I mean, she's kinda bossy, but so are you. It works." Frank chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Thanks for the expert analysis, kid." Kevin swatted his hand away, laughing. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Marty, his oldest mechanic and self-proclaimed wedding advisor, poked his head in. "Time to go, Romeo." Frank exhaled. "All right, let's do this." As they stepped outside, the wedding venue came into view, a small, cozy space at the park where golden autumn leaves framed the gathering of friends and family. Diana stood at the front, radiant, waiting with the kind of calm confidence Frank had come to love. Kevin straightened his posture, gripping the tiny pillow that held the rings. "You ready?" Frank glanced at Diana, then at Kevin. His family, his reason for everything. "Yeah, kid," he said. "I'm ready." From a distance, unseen by the crowd, Barbara stood near the tree line. The wind was gentle, carrying the faint laughter and murmurs of the wedding party. She watched as Kevin walked ahead, beaming as he presented the rings, as Frank, her son, stood with quiet certainty, no hesitation in his posture. She had known this moment was coming, and yet, standing here, watching it unfold, she felt the sharp, familiar sting of something she had long tried to ignore: regret. She could have been part of this. She could have known Kevin the way Frank did, could have been someone he ran to, not someone he feared would take him away. But she had chosen control, and in doing so, she had lost them both. Barbara took a slow breath, smoothing down her coat. This was Frank's life now, Kevin's life, and for the first time she understood that she had no place in it. She stepped back, just as the ceremony began, her silhouette fading into the golden hues of the afternoon. She didn't need to say goodbye, because in a way, she already had. And as she walked away, leaving behind the past she had tried so desperately to shape, she finally let go. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.